What's up, YouTube fans? So I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is the worst argument for a God's existence that I've ever heard before. Hands down, this argument is stunningly irrational. Like it's incredibly irrational. It's called the ontological argument for God's existence. And I'm going to read you verbatim from a website called Catholic Answers. I'm going to read you how they phrase the argument verbatim. 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. 6. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. So there's a lot of problems with this. What exactly do we mean by maximally great being? That's not like a phrase people generally use. Obviously, it probably means great to the maximum extent, but what makes something great per se? The word God isn't even included anywhere within the argument that's attempting to prove that a God exists. And then what is a possible world? Is that just a world that possibly exists? Possible world is, again, not a phrase that people generally use. And to say that something is possible, it just means that based on what we currently know, we can't prove that it isn't a thing. It may be a thing, right? But something could be possible, right? And still not real, right? And so, for something to be possible doesn't mean there's some world out there where it is, right? And if it isn't actually real, then it doesn't actually have the powers they say, right? And so therefore it couldn't use its powers to make itself real if it doesn't actually have those powers, right? And then what's also funny, right, is that I could make a reverse ontological argument using the same faulty logic. I can make a reverse ontological argument to prove that there is no maximally great being. So I'll tell you guys how that argument would go. 1. It is possible that no maximally great being exists. 2. If it is possible that no maximally great being exists, then there is some possible world in which no maximally great being exists. 3. If there is some possible world in which no maximally great being exists, then there must be no possible world in which a maximally great being exists. 4. If there is no possible world in which a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being does not exist in the actual world. 5. If a maximally great being does not exist in the actual world, then a maximally great being does not exist. 6. Therefore, a maximally great being does not exist. And now this is using all the same arguments, all the same faulty logic as the original one. So the first point of saying a maximally great is of saying it is possible that a maximally great being doesn't exist. The apologists making the original argument, they're not going to agree on that. But you got to remember, the people that they're making the argument to do agree on that. Just as they would think, the people who they're trying to convince of this, just as they would think that it's possible that a maximally great being exists, they would also think it's possible that there is no maximally great being. And so if the possibility of a maximally great being means that there's some possible world in which there is a maximally great being, then likewise the possibility of no maximally great being means that there's some possible world in which there is no maximally great being, right? And then if it is the case that if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it must exist in every possible world, then what that would therefore mean is that if there is any possible world in which there is no maximally great being, that would falsify the hypothesis of a maximally great being existing in some possible world, because by their own faulty logic, if it exists in at least one possible world, it must exist in every possible world, right? So if there is a possible world in which it doesn't exist, then it must not exist in any possible world, right? And if it doesn't exist in any possible world, then by their own logic, that would mean it doesn't exist in the actual world. And therefore, if it doesn't exist in the actual world, that would mean that it doesn't exist, right? And so using their own faulty logic, we could make a reverse argument for proving that there is no maximally great being. And so I think that it's faulty arguments like this that are part of why believers will tend to think that they don't need to give an explanation for why God himself exists, or, you know, they do kind of, but they don't actually give any legitimate explanations, right? They give like supposed explanations that don't actually explain it, right? And it's partly because of arguments like this, right? Because they think that it just is logically necessary, right? But when you break down this argument, it doesn't make any logical sense. If it's, you know, for it to be possible that there is a maximally great being, doesn't mean that there's somewhere out there where there is. There could still be nowhere out there where it is, and therefore it doesn't have any of its powers that it would have if it was real, and so it doesn't have the power to bring itself into existence. And so, I mean, not to mention that really, like, maximally great, what does that mean? Maximally great possible world, you know, it's speaking in very cryptic language. So just comes to show how irrational religious apologists will get when they're trying to convince people of their religion. All right, that's all for now. See you guys.